September 8, 1943. The armistice announcement crackled through radios across Italy, stunning soldiers who had been fighting alongside Germany for 3 years. Within hours, the Italian military dissolved into chaos. German forces prepared for this betrayal moved swiftly to disarm their former allies. In North Africa, Sicily, and mainland Italy, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers faced a stark choice. Continue fighting for Mussolini's puppet republic in the north, surrender to the Germans, and face likely deportation to labour camps, or surrender to the advancing American and British forces. For most, the decision was obvious. By the end of 1943, over 50,000 Italian soldiers had become prisoners of the United States Army, joining thousands more captured during the North African and Sicilian campaigns. What these men expected was punishment, deprivation, and possibly death. What they found instead would transform their understanding of America, democracy, and their own future. The journey into American captivity began differently than anything the Italian soldiers had experienced in their military service. Corporal Giuseppe Lamberti of the 132nd Armoured Division surrendered to American forces near Salerno on September 15, 1943. In a letter preserved in the National Archives, he described his first hours as a prisoner. "We expected to be beaten, perhaps shot. The Germans had told us the Americans were savages who took no prisoners. Instead, they gave us water, cigarettes, and food within the first hour. Real food, not the dried biscuits and rancid oil we had survived on for months. A medic treated the infected wound on my leg that our own doctors had ignored for weeks. That first night as a prisoner, I slept better than I had in a year of service to Il Duce." The initial processing camps in North Africa operated under the same principles that would govern American POW facilities worldwide. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had signed and took seriously, mandated specific treatment standards for prisoners of war. American military police received extensive training on these requirements before deployment. Officers were separated from enlisted men but treated with the dignity their rank commanded. Medical care was provided immediately. Food rations were to match what American soldiers received. Work was voluntary for officers and optional for enlisted men, with payment required for any labour performed. These weren't just regulations on paper, but actual practices enforced by the Provost Marshal General's office. Lieutenant Mario Caruso, a career officer from a Florentine military family, spent 2 weeks at a processing camp near Oran before transport to the United States. His diary, donated to the Library of Congress by his family in 1987, provides remarkable detail about the transformation from enemy soldier to protected prisoner. The Americans photographed us, recorded our information, and gave each man a prisoner of war identification card. They inoculated us against diseases. They asked about our health, our families, our education. This was not interrogation seeking military intelligence, but administrative processing that treated us as human beings with futures beyond the war. The American major who interviewed me spoke passable Italian and asked if I'd studied at university. When I told him I'd completed 2 years of law school before conscription, he noted it on my file. For what purpose I could not imagine, but the care they took suggested we were not simply to be warehoused until death. The ocean crossing on American Liberty ships exposed Italian prisoners to their first sustained encounter with American abundance. These vessels, mass-produced at a rate the Italians found incomprehensible, carried prisoners across the Atlantic throughout late 1943 and early 1944. Unlike the German transport ships they had travelled on during their own military service, the American vessels provided adequate space, functioning sanitation, and regular meals. Sergeant Paolo Ricci, a baker from Naples, kept detailed notes about the food served during his November 1943 crossing. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal with milk and sugar, scrambled powdered eggs, bread with butter and jam, and coffee with condensed milk. Lunch brought soup, canned meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit if available. Dinner included a hot meal with meat, potatoes, or pasta, vegetables, bread, and occasionally dessert. The daily caloric intake exceeded 3,000 calories, more than most Italian civilians were receiving in Italy itself. The Liberty ship SS John Muir, which transported Italian prisoners in December 1943, kept detailed records now housed at the National Maritime Museum. The ship's medical log shows that prisoners who boarded malnourished and suffering from various deficiencies showed measurable improvement during the 2-week crossing. Average weight gain among prisoners was 4 pounds during the voyage. Treating enemy prisoners better than their own army had treated them delivered a psychological impact that no propaganda could achieve. These men were experiencing firsthand the material reality that would define their captivity, and America so wealthy it could afford to feed its enemies better than fascist Italy had fed its own soldiers. When the transport ships arrived at American ports, the prisoners encountered a nation that bore no resemblance to the struggling, poverty-stricken America portrayed in fascist propaganda. Private Antonio Benedetti, a farm labourer from Calabria, described his arrival in Norfolk, Virginia in January 1944. The port stretched farther than I could see, with more ships than existed in the entire Italian Navy. Cranes moved containers as if they weighed nothing. Trucks and automobiles filled parking areas the size of my entire village. Buildings rose stories into the air, all with glass windows intact, all illuminated even in daylight. Now, this was supposed to be a nation on the edge of collapse, exhausted by war. Instead, we saw wealth and power beyond imagination. That moment, watching the casual efficiency of that single port, I understood that Italy had chosen the wrong side in a war we could never win. The train journey from coastal ports to inland prisoner of war camps provided Italian prisoners with a comprehensive view of American geography, industry, and daily life. Unlike European rail transport, where prisoners travelled in locked boxcars, American practice used passenger coaches with windows that prisoners could see through clearly. Military police guarded the cars, but prisoners were not shackled or chained. For men who had spent months in trenches or years in North Africa's desert, the journey through America became an education in democratic abundance. The trains passed through cities with lights burning despite wartime conditions. They rolled through farmland where single farms appeared larger than entire Italian villages. They crossed rivers spanned by bridges that dwarfed anything in Italy. They passed factories that operated around the clock, their parking lots full of workers' automobiles. Corporal Luigi Ferri, a mechanic from Turin who understood industrial production, kept detailed observations during his February 1944 train journey to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. We passed through a city called Pittsburgh where steel mills lined the river for miles. The scale defied comprehension. A single American steel mill appeared larger than all of Turin's industrial district. Smoke rose from hundreds of furnaces operating simultaneously. We had been told American industry was failing, that their production was propaganda. From the train window, I counted 17 major industrial facilities in less than an hour, each one larger than anything in Italy. The Germans had told us we were fighting a weak enemy. We had believed them because believing otherwise would have been too terrifying. The POW camps themselves, constructed across the American South and Southwest beginning in 1942, represented a level of infrastructure and organization that Italian prisoners found remarkable. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, which would eventually house over 3,000 Italian prisoners of war, covered thousands of acres with hundreds of buildings arranged in precise military order. Each compound included barracks with electricity, heating, and indoor plumbing. Mess halls could feed 1,000 men at once. Recreation buildings provided space for entertainment and education. Medical clinics staffed by American doctors and medical corpsmen offered care that exceeded what Italian military hospitals had provided. The camps had libraries, canteens where prisoners could purchase items with wages earned from work, and athletic fields for sports. Lieutenant Caruso, arriving at Camp Shelby in February 1944, wrote in his diary about his first impressions. The compound assigned to Italian officers included private rooms for senior officers and shared quarters for the junior officers like myself. Each room had a real bed with mattress, sheets and blankets, electric lights, steam heat and windows with glass that sealed against weather. The latrine building had multiple toilets, sinks with hot and running water and showers. This exceeded the accommodations I had known as a lieutenant in the Italian army. The German officers interned in an adjacent compound appeared equally stunned. One told me that conditions here surpassed those in many German military bases. We were prisoners, yet lived better than we had as soldiers of our own nations. The food served in American prisoner of war camps delivered perhaps the most powerful psychological impact. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, responsible for feeding both American troops and prisoners of war, operated under regulations requiring that prisoner rations match those provided to American soldiers of equivalent rank. This was not mere policy but enforced practice, with regular inspections ensuring compliance. The International Red Cross, which inspected American POW camps throughout the war, consistently reported that food quality and quantity exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. For Italian prisoners, most of whom had experienced severe rationing even before their military service and outright hunger during combat operations, the abundance seemed impossible. Sergeant Ritchie, the Neapolitan baker, found himself assigned to kitchen duty at Camp Shelby in March 1944. His letters home, which passed through American censors who left them intact because they served American interests, described meals that his family initially believed were fabricated. Breakfast typically included eggs, either fresh when available or reconstituted powdered eggs, bacon or sausage, bread with butter and jam, oatmeal or other hot cereal with milk and sugar, fruit if available, and coffee with real sugar and milk. Lunch brought soup, a main course of meat with potatoes or pasta and vegetables, bread, dessert when possible, and drinks. Dinner featured a similar structure with different preparations. The meat ration alone, at 28 ounces per man per week when available, exceeded what Italian civilians received monthly. More remarkably, the quality remained consistent. While the Italian army had routinely served spoiled meat and weevil-infested flour to its troops, American military supply chains maintained food standards that prevented such problems. Refrigeration trucks delivered fresh meat. Insulated warehouses stored supplies properly. Regular rotation prevented spoilage. When fresh food was unavailable, canned and dried alternatives maintained nutritional value. Private Benedetti, who had survived on hardtack and occasional pasta during his North African service, wrote to his wife in April 1944, "I know you will not believe me, but I must tell you the truth. Yesterday we had roast chicken with potatoes and green beans. The day before, beef stew with carrots and onions. This morning, eggs and bacon. Every day, bread that is soft and white, not the grey, hard bricks we ate in Libya. Coffee with sugar, milk. I've gained 15 pounds in 2 months as a prisoner. I eat better now than I ever did as a free man in Italy. This is not paradise. But from here I can see paradise, and it looks like an American kitchen." The provision of medical care revealed the gap between American resources and Italian military medicine even more dramatically. The Camp Shelby medical facility, typical of large POW camps, included a fully equipped clinic with examination rooms, a pharmacy, a dental clinic, and wards for patients requiring extended care. American military doctors, often assisted by Italian medical officers serving as prisoners of war themselves, treated conditions that the Italian military had ignored or inadequately addressed. Infections were treated with sulfur drugs and, as the war progressed, with penicillin. Dental problems that had plagued soldiers for years received professional care. Chronic conditions were diagnosed and managed. Men who had suffered in silence suddenly found relief. Private Francesco Romano, who had endured a hernia for 2 years because Italian military surgeons deemed it non-critical, received surgery at Camp Shelby in May 1944. His letter to his brother, a physician in Rome, expressed amazement. The American surgeon, a major from somewhere called Ohio, performed the operation with equipment and techniques I had only read about in medical journals before the war. The anesthesia was effective, the surgery quick and precise, the recovery ward clean and well staffed. The nurses, both male medical corpsmen and female army nurses, provided care that exceeded anything I witnessed in Italian military hospitals. When I thanked the major, he seemed puzzled by my gratitude, as if such treatment was simply normal. Perhaps for Americans it is. For us, it was a revelation. The dental care particularly impressed Italian prisoners, many of whom had never received professional dental treatment. Corporal Alberto Russo, a factory worker from Milan, had suffered from multiple infected teeth during his service in North Africa. Italian field hospitals lacked trained dentists and proper equipment, so soldiers endured pain with whatever analgesics could be scrounged. At Camp Shelby, Russo received comprehensive dental care, including extractions, fillings, and basic cleaning. The American dentist, a captain who had practiced in New York before the war, fixed 6 teeth over 3 visits. He used actual anesthetic, not the useless solutions we had in Africa. The equipment was modern, the clinic clean. When he finished, he gave me a toothbrush and toothpaste, items I had not seen since before the war. He explained proper dental hygiene as if I were a paying patient rather than an enemy prisoner. This casual professionalism in treating enemies demonstrated a civilization I had never encountered. The work programs established for prisoners of war revealed another dimension of American abundance and democratic principles. The Geneva Convention permitted requiring enlisted prisoners to work while prohibiting forced labor for officers. American practice went further, making work voluntary for all but offering wages that incentivized participation. Prisoners who worked received 80 cents per day initially, raised to $1 per day by 1945. This payment, made in scrip usable at camp canteens, allowed prisoners to purchase items beyond basic necessities. More significantly, the work itself exposed prisoners to American agricultural and industrial methods that revolutionized their understanding of production. By mid-1944, labor shortages in American agriculture had become acute as farm workers entered military service or moved to higher-paying factory jobs. The War Manpower Commission coordinated with the Provost Marshal General's office to deploy prisoners of war to farms across the South and Southwest. Italian prisoners, many from agricultural backgrounds, found themselves working on American farms that operated at scales they had never imagined possible. Sergeant Giuseppe Martini, a farmer's son from Tuscany, worked on a cotton plantation in Mississippi during the summer of 1944. His letters describe mechanization that exceeded anything in Italian agriculture. The farmer, who owned 3,000 acres, worked by just 6 permanent employees plus US prisoners, used machines for every operation. Tractors pulled gang plows that turned more earth in a day than 10 men with animals could manage in a week. Mechanical cotton pickers, still experimental, harvested more in an hour than 50 hand pickers. The irrigation system, powered by electric pumps, distributed water across hundreds of acres. This single American farm produced more cotton than my entire province in Tuscany. The farmer's house had electricity, indoor plumbing, a telephone, and a radio. His workers lived in houses with electric lights and running water. Even the prisoners' temporary quarters exceeded the farmhouses I knew in Italy. The agricultural work brought Italian prisoners into direct contact with American civilians, an interaction that regulations carefully controlled but couldn't completely prevent. Farmers needed workers and prisoners needed wages, creating practical arrangements that fostered human connection despite the barriers of language, nationality, and recent enmity. Private Benedetti, working on a farm near Hattiesburg, Mississippi, formed an unlikely friendship with the farmer's son, a 16-year-old boy who had grown up hearing about Italian culture from his grandfather, an immigrant from Sicily. The boy Robert spoke a few words of Italian learned from his grandfather. I spoke perhaps 20 words of English, yet we communicated through gestures, shared work, and simple humanity. He showed me photographs of his grandfather's village near Palermo. I showed him photographs of my family in Calabria. He shared his lunch with me, sandwiches made with meat and cheese and apples from their orchard. When his father saw this, I expected punishment. Instead, the farmer nodded approval. He told Robert, through gestures I understood, that kindness to prisoners was the American way. This casual generosity, extended to an enemy, taught me more about America than any propaganda could have. The canteens operated in POW camps provided another window into American consumer abundance. Using wages earned from work, prisoners could purchase items that had become luxuries in wartime Italy. The canteen at Camp Shelby stocked cigarettes from multiple American brands available at civilian prices, candy bars including Hershey's, Mars, and other manufacturers, soft drinks, particularly Coca-Cola, but also Pepsi and regional brands, toiletries including soap, shaving supplies, and toothpaste, writing materials, newspapers and magazines, and various other items. The prices, controlled to prevent exploitation, were affordable for prisoners earning $1 per day. A candy bar cost 5 cents, a Coca-Cola cost the same, a pack of cigarettes cost 15 cents. For the first time in years, these men could make consumer choices based on preference rather than desperate scarcity. Lieutenant Caruso described his first visit to the Camp Shelby canteen in March 1944. I entered with the 80 cents I had earned from teaching Italian classes to American soldiers. The shelves held more goods than I had seen in Italian shops since before the war. I purchased a Coca-Cola, having heard other prisoners discuss this strange American beverage. The first taste was sweet, carbonated, unlike anything I had experienced. It cost 5 cents, less than a lira. yet represented American abundance more powerfully than any statistic. I also bought a Hershey chocolate bar and a pack of Camel cigarettes. That evening I sat in our common room smoking American tobacco, eating American chocolate, drinking American Coca-Cola, all purchased with American wages earned while a prisoner of war. The absurdity and wonder of this situation struck me profoundly. We had gone to war against this nation believing propaganda about American weakness. We had been catastrophically deceived. The recreational and educational programs established in POW camps reflected American beliefs about rehabilitation and the long-term goal of creating democratic allies from defeated enemies. The Special Projects Division, a secret program operated by the Provost Marshal General's Office, worked to identify anti-fascist Italian prisoners and provide them with opportunities for education and leadership development. Beginning in early 1944, selected Italian POW camps began offering English classes, American history and government courses, vocational training, university correspondence courses, and various cultural activities. Participation was voluntary, but incentivized through additional privileges and consideration for trustee status that allowed greater freedom within camps. Corporal Franco Bellini, a former law student from Rome, enrolled in an English class at Camp Shelby in April 1944. The course, taught by an American lieutenant who had taught high school before the war, used methods that emphasized practical conversation rather than rote grammar. We learned English through discussion of American life and democratic principles. The lieutenant, a patient man from someplace called Iowa, explained concepts like free speech, free press, and elected government as if these were normal rather than radical ideas. He showed us American newspapers and magazines, pointing out how they criticized government policies without fear of arrest. He described elections where citizens voted for competing candidates. For men raised under fascism, where such things meant prison or death, this was revolutionary education. Not propaganda about American superiority, but simple factual description of how democracy functioned. The contrast with what we had known made itself evident. The male privileges extended to Italian prisoners of war created another connection between prisoners and the world beyond the camps. Geneva Convention requirements mandated allowing prisoners to correspond with family, and American authorities implemented this generously. Prisoners could send letters and postcards regularly, limited mainly by available transportation. The V-mail system, which photographically reduced letters to save shipping space, ensured that correspondence reached Italian families despite wartime disruptions. More remarkably, American authorities allowed Italian prisoners to send packages home, a reversal of traditional prisoner care patterns. By late 1944, Italian prisoners of war were using their wages to purchase items at camp canteens specifically to mail to their families in Italy. Sergeant Ricci sent his first package home in October 1944 after saving wages for 3 months. The package included 4 pounds of coffee, 3 pounds of sugar, 2 pounds of chocolate bars, 6 cans of Spam, soap, and cigarettes. The total cost, including postage, was approximately $12, representing 2 weeks of wages. His wife's reply, which arrived in January 1945, expressed disbelief. Maria wrote that the package arrived intact, that the coffee alone was worth more on the black market than I had earned in a year before the war, that the children cried when they tasted chocolate for the first time in their lives, that the neighbors believed we had invented a wealthier American relative. I could not explain that these luxuries came from my wages as a prisoner of war, that the enemy was feeding me well enough that I could afford to send food to my starving family. The moral contradiction was too great. How could the side we had fought against show such humanity, while our own government had left our families to starve? The treatment of Italian prisoners by American guards and administrators varied by individual and location, but generally reflected training that emphasized professionalism and adherence to Geneva Convention standards. Unlike the brutal conditions in German or Soviet prisoner of war camps, where guards routinely beat or killed prisoners, American camps maintained discipline through regulations rather than violence. Guards who mistreated prisoners faced court-martial. Commanders who allowed abuse lost their positions. The system wasn't perfect. Individual instances of mistreatment occurred, but the overall culture emphasized lawful treatment of prisoners as a reflection of American values. Private Romano described an incident at Camp Shelby in June 1944 that illustrated this culture. A guard, A corporal from some place called Texas shoved an Italian prisoner who had been slow to follow an order. The prisoner fell and injured his arm. Other guards immediately reported the incident. Within 2 hours, the corporal was placed under arrest. The captain interrogated all witnesses, including us prisoners. The corporal was court-martialed and reduced in rank. The prisoner received medical care and an apology from the camp commander. This response to a relatively minor incident demonstrated that rules applied even to those enforcing them. In the Italian army or German forces, such an incident would have been ignored or the prisoner blamed. Here the system enforced accountability. For men accustomed to arbitrary authority, this was revolutionary. The religious services permitted and facilitated in prisoner of war camps provided spiritual comfort that many prisoners had lacked during their military service. The overwhelming majority of Italian prisoners were Catholic, and American authorities made efforts to provide access to Catholic chaplains and services. Some camps had Italian priests among the prisoners who were permitted to conduct services. Others arranged for local Catholic clergy to visit regularly. The camps provided spaces for worship and supplied religious items requested by prisoners. This respect for religious practice, even for enemies, impressed men whose own military leadership had often viewed religion as competition for loyalty. Father Domenico Rossi, a military chaplain captured in Sicily who was held at Camp Shelby, conducted regular masses for Italian prisoners beginning in March 1944. His memoir, published in Italy in 1952, described the experience. The Americans provided a space in the recreation hall for services and supplied altar furnishings, candles, and wine for communion. They announced mass times and allowed prisoners to attend without restriction. Many men who had not attended mass regularly in Italy came to services here. Perhaps they sought comfort in familiar ritual. Perhaps they found in these services a connection to the Italy they remembered before fascism corrupted it. I conducted baptisms, heard confessions, performed last rites for the few who died of natural causes. The American authorities respected these sacraments fully. When I needed wine for communion and the supply had been exhausted, the camp commander personally purchased wine from a local store and delivered it to me. This courtesy to an enemy priest, this respect for spiritual needs, revealed a civilization we had been taught to despise. The inevitable comparison between American prisoner of war camps and German camps, where Italians who refused to join Mussolini's puppet republic were held, became a source of bitter irony for Italian prisoners. After September 1943, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers fell into German hands. Those who refused to continue fighting for the fascist Social Republic were deported to Germany and held in camps where conditions ranged from harsh to murderous. These men faced starvation rations, brutal treatment, inadequate shelter, disease, and forced labor in conditions that killed thousands. Letters and Red Cross reports filtering back to Italian prisoners of war in America revealed this reality, creating profound psychological turmoil. Lieutenant Caruso received news in November 1944 that his brother, also a lieutenant, was being held in a German camp in Poland. The Red Cross message indicated his brother was alive but provided no details about conditions. I cannot comprehend the moral inversion of our situation. My brother, who remained loyal to our original alliance with Germany, suffers in German captivity because he would not fight for Mussolini's puppet state. I, who surrendered to America and thus betrayed the Axis, live in comfort and safety. The supposed ally treats Italian soldiers as disposable slaves. The supposed enemy treats us with dignity and care. What does this say about our choices, our loyalties, our understanding of the world? I've concluded that we were fighting on the wrong side of history. The fascism aligned us with evil while democratic powers, however imperfect, represented civilization. The news from Italy itself, as American forces fought northward through 1944 and 1945, brought home the war's reality to prisoners who had been shielded from its worst effects. Letters from family described Allied bombing, German reprisals, partisan warfare, starvation, and the general collapse of civil society. Red Cross reports documented the desperate conditions facing Italian civilians. Newspapers and radio broadcasts, which prisoners could access, showed the devastation across Europe. The contrast between their situation and that of their families created complex emotions: guilt for their safety while loved ones suffered, relief that they had escaped the nightmare consuming their homeland. gratitude toward their captors for sparing them the war's brutality. Corporal Bellini received a letter in March 1945 from his sister in Rome describing conditions in the capital. She wrote that they ate grass soup and foraged for anything edible, that German soldiers had occupied their building and taken what little food remained, that Allied bombing had destroyed half their neighbourhood, that she weighed 80 pounds and feared she would not survive. I read this letter while eating a lunch of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter and apple pie. The moral disconnect was unbearable. I was safe and well fed while my family starved. Yet I also understood that if I'd remained in Italy, fighting for a lost cause, I would likely be dead while my family starved anyway. My presence in this American camp, as humiliating as captivity seemed initially, had become my salvation and perhaps theirs, since I could now send packages that might keep them alive. The transformation from enemy soldiers to cooperative prisoners to potential allies occurred gradually through 1944 and 1945 as Italian prisoners of war absorbed the reality of their situation. The Italian Service Units program, established in 1944, allowed Italian prisoners who signed agreements to cooperate with the Allies to work outside camps with minimal supervision. Thousands volunteered, motivated by higher wages, greater freedom, and desire to contribute to defeating Germany. These men worked on military bases, loaded ships, maintained equipment, and performed labour that freed American soldiers for combat duty. The program acknowledged what had become obvious, that most Italian prisoners had no loyalty to fascism and every incentive to support the Allied cause. Private Benedetti volunteered for the Italian service units in June 1944 and was assigned to work at Camp Shelby's motor pool. We wore American uniforms with Italy shoulder patches. We ate in the same mess halls as American soldiers. We earned the same wages. We worked alongside Americans, often performing identical tasks. The only real difference was that we remained technically prisoners and could not leave the base. But this technical distinction mattered little in practical terms. We had become, in effect, Italian soldiers serving with the American army against our former German allies. This transformation, from enemy to co-worker, happened so gradually and naturally that I hardly noticed until one day an American sergeant asked my advice on repairing a truck engine and called me Tony instead of prisoner. That moment, I realized I had crossed some invisible line from captivity to collaboration. The educational opportunities expanded significantly in 1945 as the war's end approached and American authorities began planning for post-war reconstruction. Italian prisoners of war received instruction in democracy, economics, American history, and practical skills that would help rebuild their country. University correspondence courses allowed motivated prisoners to continue or begin higher education. Vocational training programs taught trades and technical skills. The Special Projects Division intensified efforts to identify natural leaders among prisoners and provide them with intensive education in democratic principles and practices. Lieutenant Caruso enrolled in a university correspondence course in law through the University of Michigan in January 1945. The course materials arrived monthly, and I studied in the evenings after teaching Italian classes. American law, based on constitutional principles and individual rights, differed fundamentally from the codes I had studied in Florence. The concept that government power derived from citizens rather than from authority itself represented a philosophical revolution. Professors at Michigan, teaching by correspondence to an enemy prisoner, took time to write detailed comments on my essays. They treated me as a serious student rather than as an enemy to be re-educated. This respectful approach proved more persuasive than any propaganda. I was learning not just about American democracy, but experiencing it through their treatment of me. The announcement of Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, created mixed emotions in Italian prisoner of war camps. Relief that the war in Europe had ended, joy that families would no longer face combat zones, anxiety about what post-war Italy would look like, uncertainty about when they would return home, but also, surprisingly, some regret about leaving America. Many prisoners had spent nearly 2 years in camps where they had been treated better than they had been treated in their own military. They had witnessed American abundance, experienced democratic principles, formed friendships with Americans, and fundamentally revised their understanding of the world. The prospect of returning to a destroyed, impoverished Italy held little appeal. Sergeant Ricci expressed these conflicted feelings in a May 1945 letter to his wife. The war is over, and soon I will come home to you and our children. I long to see you more than I can express. Yet I confess that part of me will miss this place. Here I have eaten well, worked at fair wages, been treated with dignity, and learned what civilization can mean. I have seen what ordinary people can achieve when they live in freedom rather than under dictatorship. I fear returning to Italy will be like leaving light for darkness. But return I must, and I will bring with me everything I have learned. Perhaps we can build a new Italy that resembles what I have seen here. A nation where people eat well, work for fair wages, live in dignity and enjoy freedom. This is my hope, born from my time as a prisoner in America. The repatriation of Italian prisoners of war began in summer 1945 and continued through early 1946. Unlike the German prisoners, whose return faced delays due to ongoing tensions and the need for denazification, Italian prisoners were repatriated relatively quickly. The ships carrying them home reversed the journey that had brought them to America, but the men returning were profoundly different from the soldiers who'd been captured. They had gained weight, averaging 15 to 20 pounds heavier than when captured. They had received medical and dental care that improved their health. They had learned English and trades. They had been educated in democracy. They had experienced a level of abundance and freedom that would shape their expectations for post-war Italy. Private Romano sailed home in August 1945 on a Liberty ship carrying 3,000 Italian ex-prisoners. His final letter from America, written aboard ship and mailed when they stopped in the Azores, reflected on his captivity. I leave America after 20 months as a prisoner, and I leave it with gratitude and confusion. Gratitude for being treated as a human being rather than an enemy. Confusion because this treatment contradicted everything I had been taught about America and democracy. I arrived believing Americans were weak and decadent. I leave knowing they are strong and principled. I arrived believing fascism represented Italy's glory. I leave knowing it led us to ruin. I arrived as a soldier of Mussolini. I leave as an advocate for democracy. This transformation happened not through propaganda or coercion, but through simple observation of how a free society functions. The Americans defeated us not with weapons alone, but with the evidence of their civilization. The long-term impact of the Italian prisoner of war experience in America extended far beyond individual prisoners. These men returned to Italy as informal ambassadors of American values and democratic principles. They carried knowledge of agricultural and industrial methods that would aid reconstruction. They maintained correspondence with Americans they had met, creating personal connections between former enemies. Many would eventually immigrate to America, becoming citizens of the country that had once held them prisoner. Others would work in post-war Italy to build democratic institutions modelled on what they had observed. The Marshall Plan's success in Italy owed something to these men who had already witnessed American generosity and understood that aid came with expectations of democratic reform. Corporal Bellini returned to Rome in September 1945 and completed his law degree in 1948. He would later write a memoir about his prisoner of war experience titled American Captivity, Italian Liberation, published in Italy in 1961. In it, he summarized what many Italian ex-prisoners felt. We called the American camps almost paradise not because they were perfect, but because they were unimaginably better than what we had known. Paradise is not perfection, but the presence of basic human dignity, adequate food, medical care, fair treatment, and hope for the future. By this measure, yes, the camps were almost paradise. More importantly, they showed us that such conditions were not utopian dreams, but practical realities in societies organized around freedom rather than tyranny. We had fought against America believing we defended Italian honor. We discovered we had defended a lie. The Americans defeated us utterly, then treated us with kindness that our own government had never shown us. This contradiction forced us to confront truths we had denied. That democracy worked better than dictatorship. That freedom produced abundance while tyranny produced scarcity. That the strength we had attributed to fascism was actually weakness, while the weakness we had attributed to democracy was actually strength. These lessons, learned in American prison camps, prepared us to build the democratic Italy that emerged from fascism's ruins. The statistical record of Italian prisoner of war treatment in America supports the prisoners' testimonies. International Red Cross inspection reports from 1943 through 1946 consistently rated American camps as exceeding Geneva Convention requirements. Mortality rates among Italian prisoners of war in American custody were extremely low, less than 1% over the entire period, with most deaths resulting from pre-existing conditions or accidents rather than mistreatment. Weight gain was nearly universal, with prisoners averaging a 15 to 20 pound increase during captivity. Medical treatment addressed chronic conditions that Italian military medicine had ignored. Educational programs reached over 60% of Italian prisoners, with thousands completing substantial coursework. The food provided consistently met or exceeded American military rations. Work programs employed over 80% of Italian prisoners, with wages paid as promised. Escapes were extraordinarily rare, with fewer than 50 attempted among over 50,000 prisoners, and all escapees were recaptured without violence. The contrast with German treatment of prisoners, particularly Italian soldiers held after September 1943, could not have been starker. German camps for Italian military internees, as they were designated to avoid Geneva Convention protections, subjected prisoners to starvation rations, inadequate shelter, brutal forced labour, and casual violence. Thousands died of malnutrition, disease, and mistreatment. Red Cross access was restricted or denied. Medical care was minimal or absent. The supposed ally treated Italian soldiers with contempt and cruelty, while the supposed enemy provided dignity and care. This contradiction forced a moral reckoning that propaganda could not overcome. The American decision to treat Italian prisoners of war humanely reflected both practical considerations and genuine values. Practically, good treatment encouraged surrender and cooperation, reducing combat casualties and providing valuable labour. The Italian Service Units program contributed significantly to American logistics, while costing relatively little. But beyond pragmatism, American treatment reflected democratic values about human dignity and the rule of law. The Geneva Conventions were not merely diplomatic niceties, but expressions of principles that Americans believed separated civilization from barbarism. Treating prisoners well, even at significant cost, demonstrated American commitment to these principles. It proved that democracy meant something beyond empty rhetoric.